I'm Catherine, and I founded a company called Limina Immersive. I also produced 2 of the BBC's first VR experiences, which I'll talk a little bit about. But actually, really, this talk is about this huge challenge that we have at the beginning of the immersive media industry. There's a lot of work that's been done in the past, but we're at this point where it could, and it may well, reach the mainstream this time. And so I want to talk about what needs to be done in order for that to happen. And there's many ways that this could happen. So I want to talk about what needs to be done for this to happen in a way that could show society's best self, rather than showing off society's worst self. How to create inclusive and vibrant, exciting places that really reflect us well as people. I'll also start by talking a bit about my career so far in VR, more as a case study, really, of what is a career in virtual reality, with a few bits weaved in about what I've learned along the way. So, to start with, this picture here is me making a set for a piece that I did when I was at university. I did theatre studies at Warwick University, and it was a theatre experience that had no actors. And I was a bit obsessed by the idea of theatre without actors. But I'd never actually heard of virtual reality, and it was a good few years until I had. I moved on a few years after graduating. I worked at a company called Touch Press, and we made these big, beautiful, sort of immersive feeling book apps, a bit like a coffee table book, but an app. So, for example, we had the periodic table of elements, an app called The Elements, and you could explore it by doing these 360 rotations, wherever possible, of each element. We did T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which was interactive and performed by Fiona Shaw. And working at Touch Press as a producer and I was head of marketing, I got increasingly more interested in not just making, but also critiquing, which is something I'll come back to later. But something else I suppose I got interested in, again, I'd never heard of virtual reality, which you probably think is quite crazy, and it's a bit of a confession to admit this. But I got really interested in how to use apps to simulate reality rather than represent it, if you see what I mean. So this here is I reconstructed the moment that I thought I invented VR. So it's about 2014, and I was in the office, it was one lunchtime, and just had this idea while I was munching on my sandwich that, if I move my head at the same rate as this landscape shot, it's a panning shot of a landscape, if I move my head at this rate, and maybe put my coat over my head so I can't really take in any other information, will I feel as if I'm there, looking at that landscape? And it kind of worked. I got a sense of presence, and I was pretty overjoyed, which my colleagues found hilarious, because they'd heard of a Google Cardboard, and some of them already had Google Cardboards. And so, needless to say, after all this, much laughter about it, and they bought me a Google Cardboard headset for my birthday, which was a few weeks afterwards. And after taking it home and having some pretty, I suppose, incredible, but at the same time, trivial and gimmicky experiences on roller coaster demos, I had this sort of realization thought, which has really just carried through throughout my whole career in VR, which is that this could be the equivalent in our development of art forms as to when painting developed perspective. This is one of the first known uses of perspective in painting. It's a piece called The Tribute Money from the 1400s. And you'll see that illusion is used to help convey a story. It communicates things. And it feels really like we're moving along this continuum as creators, as artists, as humanity progresses, where we're getting better and better at simulation. We're still really good at representing, symbolism styles of media, for instance, a novel in the third person, for example. We're still really, really good at that. But also, we can create video games, or we can create immersive social spaces like Second Life. And that can be art too. And so as we get better and better at simulation, it's really exciting and concerning to think about what we could do with these superpowers that we've got. And these superpowers are something I'll come back to later, but this thought around representation and simulation is something that stuck with me. And when I left Touch Press because I really wanted to just go freelance, I got my first freelance gig with the BBC producing one of their first VR experiences. So it's the first commissioned VR documentary. It's called Easter Rising, Voice of a Rebel. And this experience lets you live through the memories of a rebel in the Easter Rising of 1916. So we launched it in time for the centenary. It came out in 2016. And it was really about exploring memory and that kind of fragmented texture of memory as well, looking at things around what is truth. So it was not photorealistic. It's a bit like stepping into a painting. And we're very inspired by Vortis's painting of the time, the look and feel of the art around 1916. The central thread, what holds it together, is a re-recording that we did of the protagonist, Willie McNeve, him describing his experiences of being in the Easter Rising as a rebel, Republican rebel, but when he was in his 80s. And he recorded this on an old cassette tape. So we took this old media and re-recorded it with Liam Cunningham. Many people know him from Game of Thrones. And that was really what held it together. And so after that, we launched that. We took it to Sheffield Doc Fest, the National Theatre for 6 weeks, Imperial War Museum, and obviously online as well. After that, I exec-produced No Small Talk, which is essentially a talk show specifically aimed at millennial women. And we had our two women, so Cherry Healy and Emma Gannon, both do quite a bit. Cherry does a lot in TV. You probably know her from BBC One presenting and BBC Three documentaries that she's made. Emma's a real kind of millennial, one of these modern stars, fully social media, but they've both done a lot of podcasting. So for them, it's like a visual podcast. So you get to sit in a coffee shop and experience what it's like to be sitting in on a really interesting conversation. So we wanted to inspire young women. I suppose for me it was about inspiring my younger self and my peers to just sit down, clear out distractions and have more in-depth conversation and to discuss, these big ideas that drive everyday life. So these two pieces, Easter Rising, Voice of a Rebel and No Small Talk, I really, really loved making them. But although, the pieces, the end result, we're very, very proud of as teams. But what frustrated me personally about it was how hard it was to get it to the audience that I'd initially intended it to get to. So we, for Easter Rising, Voice of a Rebel, me and Oscar Raby, the director, we talked a lot about wanting to get this to history enthusiasts. Not people who would come in at it from a tech perspective, but people who are interested in a content perspective. It's their feedback as well as creators that we were most interested in. Then for No Small Talk, we were most interested in getting this piece to young women. But the frustrating thing is that those distribution routes just aren't there yet, And so you can be putting blood, sweat and tears into a project, up till 2 a.m. working late for nights, yet you don't get that same feeling as, say, a film or an app or some TV. And so I suppose a kind of response and a channel for this frustration, I set up my company, Limina Immersive, which this is not the branding, it's got messed up. In fact, I skipped past it. Essentially, what Limina is all about is bringing virtual reality to broader audiences. So rather than just accepting that VR is going to be predominantly for home entertainment, mainly games, maybe sort of chat and social experiences, and ruled by Silicon Valley, like social media is at the moment, instead we want to explore other ways that it could happen, and also achieve much broader audiences, much more diverse audiences. So we work with arts venues to put on virtual reality in a pop-up VR theatre. Hopefully some of these pop-up VR theatres will become permanent as well as time goes by. And we work with VR creators in getting their work to the audiences. And recently we've also looked at then getting revenue back as well and doing profit shares. So we're interested in creating essentially the beginnings of a whole ecosystem, which is no mean feat. So now, I've talked a bit about my career, and I'll come back to some of these threads that I brought up in this part, which is where I want to talk about the audience and where we're at right now, and then what we need to do in order to get virtual reality to the mainstream. So this is a breakdown of the UK population right now and where we're at in terms of people who've tried virtual reality. So 16% of people have used VR. You put your hand up if you're one of them. Wow, yeah, that's a lot. And 45% of people haven't but want to use it. What I find most interesting about these statistics are probably as you would expect. Well, one is that available market, 45%. That is certainly more than people at tech conferences and gaming expos. That is much, much broader. There is an available market there. There is the interest. But also, when you start to break it down, we did get gender breakdown. Unfortunately, we didn't get other breakdowns for disability and ethnicity in this study. But we got that 13% of women have tried virtual reality versus 20% of men. And that's quite a gender gap. And it's a gender gap, but I find very frustrating. Just because there's lots of reasons for it. For example, virtual reality's existing content base, a lot of it's gaming, because it uses the same software to make it, a lot of the time, games engines. And there's a sort of established pocket of time that you would do VR, which is similar to the gaming experience. And most gaming and video gaming audiences are men. There are reasons like that, and there's reasons like men are more likely to buy new gadgets. They're probably more likely, if you stand outside the Apple store on the day that the new iPhone's launched, I would predict it's more likely that queue has more men in it than women. There's all these things, reasons, but that does not make it something that we should sit back and just say, okay, there are going to be these this exclusivity around this new emerging technology. So this is something that gets me up in the morning, and something that with Limina I'm really proud of, that in these pop-up VR theatres that we have a majority female audience. So as a place to start, 59% female audience we've got so far. We think we could actually change something, at least in the UK anyway. And so think about where we are in terms of the technology adoption cycle. You've probably seen familiar with this quite popular, well-used diagram of the adoption curve. So you get the innovators who either made it or they're friends with the people who made this emerging technology. Then you get the early adopters, whereas part of their identity is to have this new tech. And then new emerging technologies need to get to the early majority. But there is this well-known chasm, this difficulty in crossing the line from early adopters to the early majority. And it doesn't always work. A lot of technologies just never cross it, or they cross it, or they try to cross it, and then they retreat and they have to come back a decade or so later and have another go. Think of the Google Glass, for example. Didn't manage to cross that chasm from early adopters to the early majority. It is going back, sort of retreated, and has now come out as an enterprise software. But this is not something, this curve is not something that is inevitable. And there's healthy ways of emerging technologies crossing that chasm. And there's ways that I would say are unhealthy as well. So because technology, as it's been in the news a lot lately, it is full of biases. And so the way that things cross from early adopters to early majority, they often get imbued with those biases of the innovators and of the early adopters. What's great, though, is that we're becoming increasingly more aware of this as a culture, as a society. You think of all the recent conversation that's gone on lately around Facebook and Google and YouTube and the impact they have probably had in elections, for example. There's been a lot of discussion about this lately. It's rare that it's not covered, for instance, on the Today programme. So we're in a good place thinking about optimism. So now I just want to look at what is needed. I suppose the jobs that need to be done in order to take virtual reality from being just a cool new medium into an entire industry. And you could expand this to think about the immersive sector as a whole. Because my experience is mainly in VR, I'll focus on VR. So one thing we need, this is kind of, it's quite basic, but it's spaces, space to do it in. So that could be at home, audiences doing it at home. They could have maybe a place set up in the study, for example. Maybe a bit like when the internet first came, you'd have your computer set up in the study, or in a location, in a public space. For example, maybe it's a library, maybe that's the norm. Maybe theatre spaces, maybe it's something that you have in art galleries, maybe something like this here. We need a neutral, and you think about the early days of cinema, it took quite a long time for there to be a default. What is a cinema? Like, why are seats organized in that way? Why is the space a certain dimensions? What are the rituals that happen when you go into that space? We're needing to develop this right now, really, for virtual reality. And if in location is part of the way forward, then we need to think about these spaces and how they can be most inclusive. So something that we found at Limina is that when audiences come into our pop-up VR theatres, they're private spaces in that they're not we would never do something in like an open lobby, for example, or the corner of a bar. They're private, and people afterwards say, or even before, thank God that was not something where other people could see me, because one of the things that was concerning me about the idea of doing with VR is the idea of having my senses, my sense of sight, my sense of sound, completely covered, being vulnerable, and people being able to see me. And interestingly, the people who don't say that often tend to be young men. Most other people, we found that when you get to talking, that is a concern. So being self-conscious is one thing. Thinking about spaces being private, that's something we found. And then also getting the sort of sense of anticipation right, just the right level between getting people excited about doing this VR experience that they're about to do, or this collection of VR experiences, but then also not going too far where it makes them over-anxious and they don't want to do it at all. So some of these more sort of installation-based pieces, where if you imagine you walked through sort of a dark tunnel with lots of flashing lights and loud music, for some people that might feel great, that might feel really, get really, really excited and geared up, but others it may completely put them off doing the VR altogether. So at Limina, we're trying to create our model of the pop-up VR theatre as a space which is just got the right level of sort of anticipation versus comfort. Audiences need a motivation as well, and although that sounds obvious, it's when you start looking into it, there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want to do virtual reality, because you have to make yourself very vulnerable, as I mentioned before, in order to do it. You have to let go of your senses, or two very key senses in the real physical world that you're in order to go to that virtual world. So the motivation it's really, really important. It needs to be very strong. So maybe that motivation is about spending time with friends and family, like a leisure experience that you do, akin to going out to the cinema or going to the theatre. Maybe it's about learning. Maybe it's about escape. Maybe it's about getting home and just wanting to escape from the world. And you've got home from work, you're exhausted, and you just want to be somewhere else. Maybe it's about relaxation. The first thing really is to understand those potential use cases, and in order to get there, in order to understand it, we need to speak to audience members and understand why might they do it. And something that we found so far around motivation at Limina is that audiences, they have a slot of time already and a motivation which is about wanting to do something in the evenings with friends or family, social time, and then having something to talk about after they've done it. So conversation starter, really. So we try and fill that need as good as we can, but there are all sorts of other needs and other examples of how VR the motivations for VR in our lives. Then there's context. So what pocket of time does it fill, which we kind of talked about, but what is the normal time to do it? Coming back to cinema, it's usually something that you do in an evening, maybe like a Friday night, date night, that is a a recent term for a pocket of time and a use case. Maybe it's something that the slot is more maybe like a Sunday afternoon, that it's kind of that tinkering hobby time. But thinking of the time is important to making this a realistic proposition. And then thinking now, moving on to response, and so in building that industry response from our audiences, we need to have feedback, a way for feedback to happen. So, for instance, we have feedback forms, but there could be all sorts of other ways of getting feedback from audiences, which are also more than just numbers, but qualitative data as well, people's thoughts and ideas. We need a critical culture. We need a way that VR can be interrogated, not just the content, but also the culture and the workplace culture as well. We need some terms to use, we need some language, we need best practice, we need blueprints of formats, we need handbooks, we need distribution routes. You can see there is so much that this industry needs, which is more than the content itself, and so much thought that needs to happen. Obviously, revenue. We need revenue. We need routes that creators can get paid properly for their work in a way that's fair. And this is where I want to finish, is that we need to learn from the industry mistakes of the past. So imagine that you could go back in time and you could change something about the way that another industry, artistic industry, started. For instance, films. If you could go back 100 years and do something to change, say, Hollywood when it started, what would you do to make it healthier now? And especially with recent developments in Hollywood, I think that's an especially important question when thinking about inclusivity and content, but also workplace culture, and the two, how they interrelate together. So thinking about how would you do this differently? Well, actually, we've got this opportunity now with virtual reality. It's a new industry, it's a new sector, things are still being built, it's malleable, we have this golden opportunity. So yeah, thank you very much, and I do hope that you'll get involved some way.